tlotlo ene mo go rara le mo go morwa le mo moyeng o boitshepo jaaka ne mo tshimologong le jaana le ka gale le ka metlha le metlha yo ntseng mo tshireletsong ya magodimodimo yo le mo moriting wa mothati otlhe o tla ra morena re o botshabelo ja me le kago ya phemelo ya me o modimo wa me o ke o ikanyang gonne ke ene yo tla go gololang mo serung sa mothaisanonyane le mo leroborobong le le bolayang o tla go sireletsa ka diphuka tsa gagwe o femelega fa tlase ga tsona boammaaruri jwa gagwe ke thebele phemelo ga ona go boifa poitshego ya bosigo le semutsu o fofa motshegare le seng le roborobo le le tsamang mo lefifing le seng kgogodi e bola motshegaro wa selebalo le fa go ka wa ba le sekete ka fa letlhakoreng la gago gongwe ba le dikete di some ka fa letsogong je le jang ja gago bona ga onke go go ama o tla leba ka matlho fela bona ba ikepi ba bolawa ke se ba se jeleng gonne o rile wena morena o botshabelo jwa me o dirile magodimodimo phemelo ya gago ga onke o wela ke busula bope le boago jwa gago ga bonke bo atamelwa ke sebetso gonne o tla go laela baengele ba gagwe gore ba go boloke mo ditseleng tsotlhe tsa gago ba tla go kuka ka diatla gore dinao tsa gago di se khupiwe ke lentswe o tla gata tau le le bolobolo o gata ka ledumedi le kgogela ke tla mo pholosa ka nkgomaretse ka lerato ke tla mo sireletsa gonne o itse leina la me e tla rampitsa ke muutlwe ke nne nae mo tlalelong ke tla mo namola ke mo tlotla ke tla mo kgorisa bophelo jo boleele ke montsha pholoso ya me morena re utlwele botlhoko morena re tlhomogele pelo o botshabelo jwa rona o phemelo ya rona o modimo o re o ikanyang o botshabelo jwa me o kago ya phemelo ya me o modimo o ke o ikanyang tlotlo ene mo go rara le mo go morwa le mo moyeng o boitshepo jaaka le mo tshimologo le jaana le ka gale le ka metlha le metlha dithapelo tsena re di tsediwa ka thotloetso
o reditse radio ecclesia motswedi wa thuto le kgothatso ya tumelo
Laudator Jesus Christus, Vatican and World News.
Today, Wednesday, June 22nd, is the feast of St. John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, and St. Thomas More, martyrs. And these are today's headlines. Pope Francis appeals for aid for Afghanis struck by an earthquake that left at least 1,000 people dead. A UN report highlights the effects of the conflict in Tigray on the neighboring country of Eritrea. And the World Meeting of Families is set to kick off on Wednesday evening with a festival of families at the Vatican. In the Vatican, I'm Christopher Wells. Our top story today: at the general audience on Wednesday morning, Pope Francis assured Afghanis of his prayers for the victims of a devastating earthquake, and he also issued an appeal for aid for all those affected. At least 1,000 people have been killed and more than 1,500 injured in the quake, which struck eastern provinces of Afghanistan early Wednesday morning. The Pope also issued an appeal for help for all those affected, as Linda Bordoni reports.
Speaking during the Wednesday general audience, Pope Francis expressed his closeness to the people of Afghanistan, struck by the deadliest earthquake to rock the country in decades. I pray especially for those who have lost their lives and for their families, he said. I hope that with everyone's help, we can alleviate the suffering of the beloved people of Afghanistan. Meanwhile, on the ground, the death toll from the quake that struck a rural mountainous region in the east, close to the border with Pakistan, is rising by the hour. The 6.1 magnitude tremor reportedly damaged buildings in Khost and Paktika provinces, and poorly constructed houses have collapsed into rubble. Dozens of people are believed to be trapped under the debris, and rescue efforts are likely to be complicated since many international aid agencies left Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover of the country last year. Footage from Paktika province showed people being carried into helicopters to be airlifted from the area. Others were being treated on the ground, while family members and neighbours were seen digging the debris with bare hands. A deputy spokesman for the country's Taliban government gave no specific death toll, but confirmed that hundreds of people were killed and injured in the earthquake. We urge all aid agencies to send teams to the area immediately to prevent further catastrophe, he tweeted. The UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said search and rescue teams were being sent to the quake-hit area. I'm Linda Bordoni.
Also at the audience, the Pope condemned widespread violence in Mexico following the murder on Monday of 2 Jesuit priests who were slain in a church in the north of the country, together with a layperson. They were apparently killed after the man fled an armed individual and took refuge in the church, according to authorities. The assailant reportedly pursued and caught up with the man, killing him along with the 2 priests. After expressing his sorrow and dismay at the murders, Pope Francis went on to decry the many killings that occur in Mexico, insisting once again that violence does not solve problems, but instead increases unnecessary suffering. The Pope also urged everyone to remember Ukraine as Russia's invasion grinds on. The Pope noted that the children who rode with him in the square and the Pope-mobile on Wednesday were refugees from Ukraine. Let us not forget Ukraine, he appealed. Let us not lose the memory of the suffering of that martyred people. The Pope's reiterated call to not forget the suffering caused by the war in Ukraine and by the many other conflicts around the world has become an almost daily plea. And as the Vatican Secretary for Relations with States, Archbishop Paul Gallagher, recalled on the sidelines of a visit he has undertaken to North Macedonia, Pope Francis also continues to appeal for a culture of encounter and solidarity in order to avoid the downward spiral into war.
The Pope has pointed out 3 things that he believes are necessary, perhaps in almost any society, if we are to avoid hatred and potentially conflict and war. First of all, the Pope says we should encourage dialogue between the generations. Secondly, he talks about education as a key factor, and we have to work for freedom, responsibility, and development. If we're working on these fronts, we will be going a long way to avoiding situations which can lead to war. And, or shall we say, the other side of the coin being that we'll consolidate and guarantee peace. And the final thing the Pope suggests is the respect for human dignity. And this is really at the very basis of Catholic teaching about relations, about how countries relate to each other, how societies work together, and how we achieve justice among people, human dignity. And as we can see in the terrible conflict with the hundreds, thousands of deaths in Ukraine, human dignity is what is not being respected.
And that was Archbishop Paul Gallagher, the Holy See's Secretary for Relations with States. In other world news, a report on the situation of human rights in Eritrea, presented to the UN Human Rights Council, has highlighted the application of force in gathering recruits for military service in the country. The report, presented by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Eritrea, covered several aspects of the situation in the Horn of Africa, including the impact on the conflict in Tigray on Eritrea. Father Benedict Mayaki has the story.
The Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea, Mohamed Abdesalam Babika, has put the spotlight on reports of forced recruitment of people, including of children, by Eritrea to fight in the ongoing conflict in the northern Tigrayan region of Ethiopia. In a report presented to the 50th session of the United Nations Human Rights Council, Babica highlighted that the continuing involvement of Eritrea in the war in Ethiopia has important implications for the internal human rights situation in the country. The report identified some worrying trends in the country, noting the increased militarization of Eritrea and the use of military conscription rates or JIFA to enlist people to go to the front lines. Babica noted that since November 2020, conscripts have been forced to fight in a gruesome war in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, but the families of those forced to fight have not received information about their whereabouts. More so, while only men and women over the age of 18 have the duty to serve in the national service, there has been a worsening in the forced conscription of children, with reports of rounding up of children, some as young as 14 years old. Some children were also deployed for military combat in Tigray with limited training, and according to reports received by the rapporteur, a large number of children were allegedly injured or killed during the early stages of the conflict. Babica also pointed at the situation of Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia, saying that many fleeing the dismal human rights conditions in their country are forcefully returned, detained, punished, and forcibly conscripted by the same military forces they had fled. In light of this, the rapporteur proposed, among other things, that the government of Eritrea investigates the recruitment of children by the country's armed forces and for them to take the necessary steps to prevent the conscription and deployment of child soldiers. The rapporteur also called for the immediate withdrawal of Eritrean forces from Ethiopia and abstention from obstructing the access of humanitarian personnel, food, and supplies to the country. I'm Father Benedict Mayaki.
Elsewhere, African bishops are calling on governments to take urgent and ambitious action to protect biodiversity. Their appeal is contained in a statement released Tuesday by the Symposium of Episcopal Conferences of Africa and Madagascar, SECAM, during an event in Nairobi, where preparatory sessions are taking place for the United Nations Biodiversity Conference, COP15, in October. The bishop's appeal is being supported by the Laudato Si movement and by the Ecclesial Network on the Congo Basin Forest, as Lisa Zengarini reports.
COP15 will convene governments from around the world to agree to a new set of goals for nature over the next decade through the Convention on Biological Diversity post-2020 framework process. Ahead of the conference, the African bishops have taken a public stance on this crucial issue in a document released during an event organized in Nairobi in collaboration with the Laudato Si movement and the Ecclesial Network on the Congo Basin Forest. In line with Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si, the statement points out that protecting nature and the most vulnerable go hand in hand. We have no right to destroy biodiversity, they say. For this reason, the African bishops have joined those who are calling for 50% of the earth to be protected by 2030. SECAM also calls for the respect of the rights of indigenous peoples and the immediate stop of the construction of the East Africa crude oil pipeline, which will displace about 118,000 people in Uganda and Tanzania, threatening wetlands, wildlife and fresh water sources that support millions of people. The SECAM statement makes special reference to the biomass of the Congo Basin, the second largest tropical rainforest in the world, where illegal and unsustainable logging, along with land grabbing and industrial agriculture, put indigenous people and endangered species at risk. In this regard, the African bishops point out that the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis are intimately linked, and that the ecological problem is inseparable from its social dimension. The statement finally calls on the governments to be transparent and to be held accountable. I am Lisa Zengarini. Finally calls on the governments to be
News from the Vatican. The Holy See Press Office announced that the Council of Cardinals held an online meeting on Tuesday afternoon in the presence of Pope Francis, who joined them from Casa Santa Marta. Cardinals Oscar Maradiaga, Reinhard Marx, John Patrick O'Malley, Oswald Gracias, and Fridolin Ambongo Bizongo joined the virtual meeting, while Cardinals Pietro Parolin and Giuseppe Bertello joined in from the Vatican. Finally, the 10th World Meeting of Families begins Wednesday evening in Rome, set to focus on the theme Family Love, Vocation, and the way to holiness. In addition to events being celebrated in dioceses and parishes around the world, some 2,000 delegates from 120 countries have been invited to Rome to take part in the 5-day event, which aims to highlight the urgency of proclaiming the beauty of marriage and the family today. Francesca Merlo tells us more.
The meeting is being held at a difficult time for humanity, tried by the pandemic and war. Gabriella Gambino, Undersecretary of the Dicastery for Laity, Family and Life, promoter of the event, spoke to Deborah Donini about these difficulties as well as her hopes for the event. She describes her hopes as being of hearing words of encouragement from the Holy Father, so that when this year of the family is over, we will all be able to continue on a journey together. Gabriella Gambino then describes the importance of involving children in the pastoral work of evangelization, explaining that the whole family is called to Christian proclamation, and that today one of the greatest challenges for parents is precisely that of transmitting to our children the awareness and also the courage to proclaim Christ present in our families. Formation, accompaniment, and the transmission of the faith to the new generations are some of the themes. The fundamental one is a proclamation of the vocation of each family, of each person within the family, says Gabriella Gambino. She explains that the family is a path to holiness and sanctification that each of us has at our disposal.
And that was Francesca Merlo highlighting some of the themes of the World Meeting of Family, which opens this evening with the Festival of Families at the Vatican. That will be brought to you live on our Vatican media channels, including the Vatican Facebook page, the Vatican Twitter feed, and our web portal, www.vaticannews.va. Many thanks this afternoon go to our producers and sound engineers in the studio. Please join us, as we said, at our Vatican media channels for the World Meeting of Families today and over the course of the next few days. In the Vatican, I'm Christopher Wells.
The church is in Africa, at the service of reconciliation, peace and justice. The church is in Africa, at the service of reconciliation, peace and justice.
This is the Africa service of Vatican Radio.
Welcome to our half-hour daily program for Africa.
In today's program, you can hear our feature, Health and Healing. First, however, our bulletin of church news, followed by African News Panorama. I am Festus Tarawali. Pope Francis continued his catechesis on the value of old age at the general audience on Wednesday, saying the elderly should embrace their frailty and helplessness in order to follow and bear witness to Christ. Devin Watkins reports.
Focusing his catechesis at the Wednesday general audience on the conversation Jesus had with Peter at the end of John's Gospel, Pope Francis reflected on the gradual wasting away of physical strength with age. Despite causing suffering, the Pope said old age offers a chance to embark upon a new way to follow Christ. Pope Francis said Jesus warns Peter that when he was young, he was master of his own life, but that when he grows old, his testimony would be accompanied by weakness. Besides alluding to Peter's martyrdom and death, Jesus' words can also be understood as inviting him to learn to bear witness in a new way in his old age.
E anche la tua testimonianza, dice Gesù, ti accompagnerà a questa debolezza.
Your following, said the Pope, will have to learn to allow itself to be instructed and molded by your frailty, helplessness, and dependence on others, even in dressing and in walking. In old age, he added, we learn to bear consistent witness in the conditions of a life largely entrusted to others.
Disponiamo di una spiritualità realmente capace di interpretare la stagione.
Is our spirituality truly capable of interpreting this time of our weakness entrusted to others, rather than to the power of our autonomy, he wondered? Old age is certainly a time of trial and temptation, said Pope Francis, and he noted that Peter points to this truth in his question to Jesus, referring to the younger, beloved disciple. What about him? Jesus' response was frank and even coarse.
A te che importa? Tu seguimi.
What does it matter to you? You follow me. The elderly, said Pope Francis, should not be envious of the young who will outlive them. The honor of their faithfulness to their sworn love, their fidelity to following the faith they have believed, he said, is their title of admiration for the generations to come and of grateful recognition from the Lord. Pope Francis concluded his catechesis ensuring the elderly that their forcibly inactive act of following the Lord, listening to him and contemplating him, will become the best part of their lives. I'm Devin Watkins.
Pope Francis on Wednesday said he is praying for the victims of a devastating earthquake that struck Afghanistan in the early hours of Wednesday. Some reports have put the death toll at around 1,000 and some 600 injured. Linda Bodoni reports.
Speaking during the Wednesday general audience, Pope Francis expressed his closeness to the people of Afghanistan, struck by the deadliest earthquake to rock the country in decades. I pray especially for those who have lost their lives and for their families, he said. I hope that with everyone's help, we can alleviate the suffering of the beloved people of Afghanistan. Meanwhile, on the ground, the death toll from the quake that struck a rural mountainous region in the east, close to the border with Pakistan, is rising by the hour. The 6.1 magnitude tremor reportedly damaged buildings in Khost and Paktika provinces, and poorly constructed houses have collapsed into rubble. Dozens of people are believed to be trapped under the debris, and rescue efforts are likely to be complicated since many international aid agencies left Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover of the country last year. Footage from Paktika province showed people being carried into helicopters to be airlifted from the area. Others were being treated on the ground, while family members and neighbours were seen digging the debris with bare hands. A deputy spokesman for the country's Taliban government gave no specific death toll, but confirmed that hundreds of people were killed and injured in the earthquake. We urge all aid agencies to send teams to the area immediately to prevent further catastrophe, he tweeted. The UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs said search and rescue teams were being sent to the quake-hit area. I'm Linda Bodoni.
Also, at the general audience on Wednesday, Pope Francis condemned the killing of 2 Jesuit priests and a layperson in Mexico, saying it was a shocking reminder of the level of violence in the country. He said, I express my pain and shock over the killing in Mexico the day before yesterday of 2 religious brothers of mine, Jesuits, and 1 layperson. I am close in prayer and affection to the Catholic community hit by this tragedy, he said. Once more, I repeat that violence does not resolve problems, but increases episodes of suffering. 79-year-old Father Javier Campos Morales and 80-year-old Father Joaquim Cesar Mora Salazar were slain inside the church in Cherokee in Chihuahua State. They were apparently killed after a man fleeing a drug gang took refuge in the church, authorities said. In a statement released after the murder, the Mexican province of the Society of Jesus demanded justice and the return of the bodies of the priests, which were removed by the armed men. In his greetings in Italian at the end of the audience, the Pope urged everyone to remember Ukraine as Russia's invasion grinds on. He said the children riding with him in the Pope mobile in St. Peter's Choir on Wednesday were refugees from Ukraine. Let us not forget Ukraine, he appealed. Let us not lose the memory of the suffering of that martyred people, said the Pope. The grouping of all the bishops' conferences of Africa, known as the Symposium of Episcopal Conferences of Africa and Madagascar, SECAM, on Tuesday issued a statement calling on governments to take urgent and ambitious action to protect biodiversity. The text was presented at an event in Nairobi, Kenya, where preparatory sessions are taking place for the upcoming UN Biodiversity Conference, or COP15, to be held in Montreal in Canada from the 5th to the 17th of December. The meeting, which has been delayed 3 times, was originally scheduled to take place in Kunming in China. The SECAM document points out that the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis are intimately linked. Lisa Zengarini reports.
COP15 will convene governments from around the world to agree to a new set of goals for nature over the next decade through the Convention on Biological Diversity post-2020 framework process. Ahead of the conference, the African bishops have taken a public stance on this crucial issue in a document released during an event organized in Nairobi in collaboration with the Laudato Si movement and the Ecclesial Network on the Congo Basin Forest. In line with Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si, the statement points out that protecting nature and the most vulnerable go hand in hand. We have no right to destroy biodiversity, they say. For this reason, the African bishops have joined those who are calling for 50% of the earth to be protected by 2030. SECOM also calls for the respect of the rights of indigenous peoples and the immediate stop of the construction of the East Africa crude oil pipeline, which will displace about 118,000 people in Uganda and Tanzania, threatening wetlands, wildlife and fresh water sources that support millions of people. The second statement makes special reference to the biomass of the Congo Basin, the second largest tropical rainforest in the world, where illegal and unsustainable logging, along with land grabbing and industrial agriculture, put indigenous people and endangered species at risk. In this regard, the African bishops point out that the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis are intimately linked, and that the ecological problem is inseparable from its social dimension. The statement finally calls on the governments to be transparent and to be held accountable. I am Lisa Zengarini.
The 10th World Meeting of Families kicks off in Rome on Wednesday evening with the Festival of Families, with Pope Francis scheduled to deliver an address to the participants in the Paul VI Hall. In keeping with tradition, the June 22nd to the 26th World Meeting of Families also includes a traditional International Theological Pastoral Congress, as well as a final Eucharistic celebration. Organized by the Dicastery for Laity, Family and Life, the World Meeting of Families is held this year under the theme Family Love, a Vocation and Path to Holiness. You are tuned to the Africa service of Vatican Radio.
African News Panorama.
The African Union has suspended its participation in the United Nations facilitated talks to end the Sudan political crisis. Its representative in the talks cited lack of transparency and exclusion of important political actors from the process. The African Union and the Regional Bloc Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, had previously backed the United Nations-led intra-Sudanese dialogue process, which began on 8th June. The dialogue was, however, postponed indefinitely a few days later after the former ruling Forces of Freedom and Change, FFC coalition, refused to join its sessions. The FFC is demanding the military to leave power and return power to a civilian transitional government. Malawi's President Lazarus Chakwera has stripped his Vice President Saulos Chilima of all his delegated powers. President Chakwera's action is a consequence of the naming of Chilima in $150 million United States dollars corruption scandal involving government contracts. President Chakwera said that a report by the country's Anti-Corruption Bureau named 53 current and former officials as having received money from British Malawian business person Zuneth Satar between 2017 and 2021. This is in relation to 16 contracts that the Malawi Police Service and the Malawi Defense Force awarded to 5 companies belonging to Satar. Chakwera joined forces with Chilima to defeat incumbent Peter Mutharika in 2020 presidential elections. The pair had promised to fight corruption in government. In a surprise move, Burkina Faso's military ruler has met the president that he overthrew in a coup d'etat last January. Former President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore was accompanied by another former president, Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo, for the talks. Officials said the meeting showed Lieutenant Colonel Ponhari Damiba's desire for reconciliation and that the country's security situation was discussed. Back in January, Lieutenant Colonel Damiba said He had toppled Kabore because he had failed to stop the attacks by jihadist fighters. Despite a promise to improve security, the violence has continued in the country. The British Home Office says the Rwanda removals policy might have slowed the flow of migrants across the English Channel. Home Office senior official Matthew Rycroft on Wednesday told members of parliament that the number of crossings is higher than at the same point last year, but lower than the department's projection. He also revealed the fact that 47 people had originally been told they would take off on the flight that was arranged last week and then cancelled when legal challenges prevented the removal of asylum seekers. Meantime, the block by the European Court of Human Rights on sending asylum seekers to Rwanda could be overturned by ministers under new proposals. The plan, which is being introduced to the United Kingdom Parliament, would allow ministers to ignore the European Court of Human Rights injunctions. It is an addition to planned changes to the Human Rights Act and could also affect future cases involving migrants. You are tuned to the Daily Africa service of Vatican Radio.
You are welcome to this week's edition of Health and Healing. The World Health Organization, the WHO, has expressed concerns about the outbreak of monkeypox, which is spreading to countries that have never had an outbreak in the past. The disease is caused by a virus. Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus is the Director General of the World Health Organization.
So far this year, more than 1,600 confirmed cases and almost 1,500 suspected cases of monkeypox have been reported to WHO from 39 countries, including 7 countries where monkeypox has been detected for years and 32 newly affected countries. So far this year, 72 deaths have been reported from previously affected countries. No deaths have been reported so far from the newly affected countries. WHO's goal is to support countries to contain transmission and stop the outbreak with tried and tested public health tools, including surveillance, contact tracing, and isolation of infected patients. It's also essential to increase awareness of risks and actions to reduce onward transmission for the most at-risk groups. WHO is also working with partners and experts from around the world on changing the name of monkeypox virus, its clades, and the disease it causes. We will make announcements about the new names as soon as possible. The global outbreak of monkeypox is clearly unusual and concerning. It's for that reason that I have decided to convene the emergency committee under the international health regulations next week to assess whether this outbreak represents a public health emergency of international concern.
The disease was first confirmed in the Western Hemisphere in May this year. From May 18th onwards, cases were reported from an increasing number of countries and regions, predominantly in Europe, but also in North and South America, Asia, Africa, and Australia. Dr. Rosemary Lewis is an official of the World Health Organization, heading the department charged with fighting monkeypox. She explains the symptoms of the disease.
Monkeypox is not a new disease. It was first discovered in a monkey in 1958, and hence the name. However, the first infection in a human was discovered in 1970 in a small child in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Since that time, increasing numbers of cases have been recognized, and in particular over the last 5 to 10 years. What's different now is that we're seeing cases in other countries that normally don't have monkeypox, and this is very unusual. We've had the occasional outbreak or single case detected in a traveler from West Africa. But in fact, we've never seen an outbreak like this before. The most important thing about monkeypox is that it does cause a rash, which can be uncomfortable, it can be itchy, and it can be painful. So the most important thing about caring for someone with this illness is basically taking care of the skin, and taking care of any symptoms that someone might have, such as pain or itchiness. It's important to know that research over many years has also yielded some vaccines and treatments for monkeypox. These are new products and not yet widely available. However, the vaccine is recommended for persons who have been in contact with someone who has monkeypox. When it comes to treatment, most people don't need the new products. Most people don't have a severe case of monkeypox and can be managed conservatively with regular care. Where it's necessary, it may be possible to access the new treatments for a very select few patients who may need them.
As Dr. Rosamond has explained, monkeypox has been known to exist in Central and parts of West Africa for many years. This is the first time that the disease has spread widely. Dr. Rosamond has said that a vaccine exists for the disease, but the WHO recommends it with caution. Here is Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the WHO.
We have published interim guidance on the use of smallpox vaccines for monkeypox. WHO does not recommend mass vaccination against monkeypox. While smallpox vaccines are expected to provide some protection against monkeypox, there is limited clinical data and limited supply. Any decision about whether to use vaccines should be made jointly by individuals who may be at risk and their healthcare provider based on an assessment of risks and benefits on a case-by-case basis. It's also essential that vaccines are available equitably wherever needed. To that end, WHO is working closely with our member states and partners to develop a mechanism for fair access to vaccines and treatments.
Monkeypox is very infectious and spreads very fast.
Monkeypox spreads through close face-to-face, skin-to-skin, direct contact. This is how it's always been described. There may be some new things happening in this outbreak now. We don't know everything. There's still a lot to learn. So at the moment, the people who are most exposed appear to be men who have sex with men. So it's really important that all of us together make sure that the messages reach the people who need to have them right now. That is people who may be at risk right now. And right now, those people are men who have sex with men or other ones who may be in contact with them, including family members. So because this virus does spread through close contact and person-to-person contact, it does mean that in the healthcare setting, a health worker who doesn't know what they're dealing with and may not have the right personal protective equipment may inadvertently be exposed. So we also want to be sure that health workers have the message that if they're seeing someone who may have a rash that is undiagnosed or has not previously been diagnosed, it's critically important to be aware that this virus is now newly spreading in different population groups and to ensure that all the basic precautions are taken to protect yourself with personal protective equipment. Likewise, if there's someone who has monkeypox, lives in a family setting, may also want to take care that other members of the family are not immediately at risk. So while we're talking about who is most at risk, of course, it's really important not to generate stigma against population groups that are at risk. This includes men who have sex with men. It can also include people who are traveling from different countries who may be carrying the virus without knowing it. It's really critical that we avoid stigma. The reason is that if people feel stigmatized, they will not feel comfortable coming forward for diagnosis and care. And we really do want to reach the people who may be at risk.
Although monkeypox is swift in spreading, the World Health Organization is describing the infection as moderate. Dr. Rosamond explains why the WHO is concerned about the current outbreak.
Most people who have monkeypox do not become very ill. However, WHO has described the risk as moderate because monkeypox is spreading in locations where it has never been reported before. So this new pattern of transmission is concerning, and it's moving quite quickly. So it's really important for WHO and all countries and all parties and all stakeholders at the community level to understand where the risk may be, who may be at risk, so that people can protect themselves. This is the message that we would like to share, is that people can protect themselves. If you know your own risk, you can lower your own risk.
Dr. Rosamond Lewis, the head of the World Health Organization's department charged with fighting monkeypox. In another development, the World Health Organization has expressed concerns about the acute food insecurity in Eastern Africa, which has affected millions of people as a result of a long drought. Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus again.
Drought has pushed over 30 million people in Djibouti, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, and Uganda into acute food insecurity. Many families have left their homes in search of food, water, and pasture. The implications for health are severe. Malnourishment can have a lifelong impact on health and makes people increasingly vulnerable to disease. Severely malnourished children are 9 times more likely to die of diseases such as cholera and measles. WHO has now graded this crisis as a grade 3 emergency, the highest level in our internal system. A grade 3 emergency means that we are coordinating the response across all 3 levels of the organization: country offices, regional offices, and headquarters. Our priorities are supporting countries to fight outbreaks and to make sure people have access to the essential health services they need.
And lastly, reports from many countries around the world indicate a decline in the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths. However, in East and Central Africa, the number of new infections is reported to be rising.
The global decline in reported COVID-19 cases and deaths is continuing. Reported cases and deaths have now both fallen more than 90% from their peaks earlier this year. This is a very welcome trend. Still, more than 3 million cases were reported to WHO last week, and because many countries have reduced surveillance and testing, we know this number is underreported. And 8,737 deaths were reported. 8,737 deaths too many. We cannot become numb to these numbers. There is no acceptable level of deaths from COVID-19. When we have the tools to prevent, detect, and treat this disease, many of us who live in high-income countries have easy access to those tools. We now take them for granted. But for many people around the world, these tools remain scarce commodities. WHO is aware that countries are discussing a temporary waiver on intellectual property rights for COVID-19 tools at the World Trade Organization's Ministerial Conference this week. I hope countries will come to an agreement on a waiver, not just for vaccines, but for diagnostics and therapeutics as well.
That was Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the World Health Organization, the WHO. And that was Health and Healing for this week. This has been Johnny Baptist Tumosime.
You are tuned to the Africa service of Vatican Radio. In our next program at the same